Hello, and thank you for joining us in this episode 18 of the Well Bible Reading Journey. I'm so glad that you're joining us for this. This week, we are reading in our Well Bible Reading Journey journals in Genesis chapter 49, chapter 50, and Exodus chapter 1, and then Psalms chapter 17. And in the New Testament, we're in Matthew chapter 17, which covers a really big moment in Jesus' life known as the Transfiguration. So we're going to get to that. But we want to go ahead and go and dive right into the Word. I hope that you're following along with us, and I pray that God is blessing you as you do that. And I pray this time we have podcasting together, I pray that it's a blessing to you as well. I'm going to ask Amber and Craig to join me. Amber and Craig, thanks for being here.
Hello.
Yeah, good to see you. I'm glad you're with us today. We're going to be talking mainly about Genesis chapter 50 in the Old Testament. We want to kind of zero in on Genesis chapter 50, although the chapters around it's all the same story. And there's this kind of seamless thing between Genesis and Exodus that you get definitely the sense that this is a continuation of the same story. But let's start with Genesis chapter 50. This is the kind of the farewell chapter, the last chapter of Genesis. So Craig, let me start with you. What are some of the things that you grabbed out of Genesis chapter 50? What kind of leapt out at you?
Yeah, thanks, Ellis. As you said, this is really a farewell and kind of a wrapping up of a long journey that we've all been on. For us in Genesis, it's been 4 months now. We're in May today. And so as we complete this journey out and we say goodbye to Jacob and Joseph, it just strikes me that we're saying bye to some friends. We've really spent a long time with these guys. And what do we have left? We have basically a couple of mummies at the end of the day. At the end of the chapter, both Jacob and his son Joseph, whose death is covered in the last few verses of chapter 50, are mummified and embalmed, and they're put in a coffin. Now, of course, the difference is, as we read through this chapter, Jacob is returned to his homeland, and in verse 13, we see he's buried in the cave of the field of Machpelah. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. The field of Mamre, which, of course, we remember from earlier in Genesis during Abraham's life. That was the same cave that Abraham himself had bought. And so we see the theme of goodness in Genesis comes full circle here. In Genesis 1, God created everything very good. And Genesis begins with a big bang, but kind of literally ends in a small cave. The particular people of God are well on their way to saving the cosmos. Or at least God is going to save the cosmos through them. But the failures of humanity and the call of God to righteousness reverberate through the ages in this one little cave where they've buried Jacob, and the one in whom God sees the promised salvation of humanity. Because we play that forward, and I think of another cave that's empty after the Easter and the resurrection of our Lord. And so I had those echoes and those reverberations playing through my head as I thought of this cave where they buried Jacob. I thought of the empty cave of Easter.
Yeah, that's great. There is a lot of compare contrast going on here with Jacob and Joseph. It's interesting. They're buried, or they're prepared for burial as if they were Egyptians, right? And Joseph really has been in Egypt longer than he had been in the Promised Land before. He was a very young man when he was sold into slavery. So he has an Egyptian wife. His children are part Egyptian, right? So he's very much in some ways Egyptian in his culture, and the way that they're prepared for death, the embalming. And the Egyptians, of course, had perfected this system for embalming, right? Embalming was huge. In fact, it's probably invented by the Egyptians, preserving these bodies and the elaborate caves, either the caves or pyramids or whatever. And those were, of course, for the kings only. But you see even Jacob and Joseph both kind of being treated almost as royalty in the way that they're embalmed. And then Joseph going back to the cave, the very simple cave, and that cave at Mamre was the only piece of property that Abram ever owned. He bought it to bury his wife Sarah there. It becomes the family burial cave. It's the only piece of property they own, and they're brought back there, right? That's very interesting, the way that takes place. Amber, did you see this compared contrast in there and kind of what we're talking about?
Yeah, you guys hit home definitely the same notes I was checking on this week. Actually, when I was in college, I was lucky enough to do a mission trip and spent quite a bit of time in Egypt. And while we were there, I was able to actually visit the Valley of the Kings. So
Awesome.
these very tombs that you were discussing, I've actually been there. And one of the things that was interesting is that I made some friends with some locals, and they were like, "Whatever you do, don't go to the King Tut's area there was the only one you had to pay money for because I think he's the most well known for tourists.
Yeah.
So the tourists are willing to spend some money to go to this tomb. And because he died so young, it was very empty. Like there was nothing grand about it, but yet it was the only one you paid money for. So a local person was like, whatever you do, don't pay the money for King Tut. Hike to the back to the where all the greatest, the oldest king pharaohs were. And so I took that advice. We hiked quite a bit, a couple hours. We hiked back and we got to go experience the Pharaoh Ramsey the Third, which
Mhm.
is actually the Pharaoh we see in Genesis in Exodus 1, which is really cool. I don't think I put those two things together until this week.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, these tombs of these pharaohs were extraordinary. I mean, words cannot express the vibrant colors and the painting and the beauty of the art and the I don't have words. You have to
Yeah.
just experience it one day. And then I too, Ellis, you called the cave that they ended up being in Canaan. You described it as simple. That's exactly what I envisioned this week compared to what I have seen in person. I can imagine this little cave in Machpelah, and how simple and how non,
Yeah.
I don't know,
Elaborate. No.
grand it
Yeah.
was compared to what I've seen. So I was thinking the same thing. And also, Abraham, Isaac, and their wives were all buried there. And if you found that cave today, they would not be there, but there would be two mummies there of Jacob and Joseph, which would be really interesting to find. If I was a cave adventurer, that would
Yeah.
be something to find. The only
Yeah.
other thing I noticed I wanted to quickly ask you, Ellis, because I noticed how elaborate the information was given about Jacob's death and burial and this whole like grand great company of people who went, how the mourning process. I saw that it was 70 days the Egyptians mourned for Jacob, and I
Mhm.
also noticed that royalty actually they mourned Egyptians mourned for 72 days, so Jacob was close to royalty if you think of it that way.
Mhm.
Why all the elaborate, because none of the other patriarchs got this much text about their death and burial.
No, that's right. They were lucky to get 2 or 3 lines.
Exactly.
Even Abraham, who's considered the father of faith. No, there is definitely more ink spent on Jacob in his life than any of the other patriarchs. If you, especially if you include the narrative about his sons, Joseph and the rest, there's just a lot of material on Jacob and his family. And as you pointed out, even like in this scene, it shows how the Egyptians treated him almost like royalty. So there was this tremendous respect for Jacob as well. Um, and I think it's basically just pointing to the fact that this is the birth of a nation. We talked about it last week how the narrative is really moving from about being individual patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to being about the tribes and about the nation that is forming here. So what you have in Jacob is the birth of a nation. And so I think the text goes to great pains to show us that this is a royal priesthood, a royal nation, as we're called, as Jesus calls us, a royal priesthood. This is something special that's happening here. So they take their time with Jacob. It's almost like it slows down, and they really stretch out the story of Jacob. They want to show the birth of this nation and how super important this is. So you have this burial both of Jacob and Joseph. To Craig's point, Jacob requests, "I want to go back to the promised land now. As soon as I die, take me back. Don't wait." You have Joseph being buried basically, or entombed in Egypt in the Egyptian way, the embalming and everything, but requesting that when we leave, be sure you take my bones with me, right? And we'll see at the end of Exodus when that happens, they actually do. They grab his bones. Let's not forget his bones. We're taking them with us. And the assumption is that eventually they're placed in that same cave with his forefathers. But you have uh, these two bodies, if you will, in the cave, Jacob and Joseph, who are dressed like royalty, right? So Abraham, very simple burial. Sarah, Isaac. It's all very simple burials. These are elaborate, and it is this kind of idea of royalty. This nation is being born, and these are the founding kings, if you will, of that nation. That idea is very much there. There's something else in this story that's really interesting to me. We haven't hit on yet, but it's the scene where when Jacob dies, and the brothers, it seems like they revisit this idea of Joseph's going to come after us again, right?
Mhm.
Did you guys key into that? And what did you think about that, Amber? What did you get there? Because it's like this tension is bubbling up again, and I'm not sure why.
Exactly. I was like, man, that guilt is just holding on strong. They probably still feel very guilty. And so when the father had passed, they were like, oh man, I should we worry? And we see Joseph's beautiful response back to them. He's like, sorry, Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in place of God? But for you meant for evil against me, but God meant for good. We've talked about this in earlier passages.
Yeah.
I that is such an incredible imagery for it. But I want to point out one thing, and I'm going to let Craig speak on this. One thing first. It dawned on me when I was reading this. It doesn't say that God turns evil into good. Let's be mindful of how the text is written. It doesn't say God turns evil into good, because he doesn't. He says what was meant for evil, God will redeem it for good. I just want to make sure that we clarify those are two very different things here. So let's not be confused that God is not going to take something evil and turn it into good. He's not going to turn the pit into a party, right?
Yeah.
He's not going to magically do that, right? He's going to allow the pit to happen, but God goes ahead of it and he redeems it for his glory. So, Craig, go ahead. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're onto a very important point there, Amber. It's a very important aspect of our faith that we're in danger of losing sight of if we don't bring ourselves back to the anchor of it. And Jesus hits a little bit. We'll see Jesus hit a little bit on this in Matthew 17 with the parable of the mustard seed. So I'll save some of what I'm going to say for then. But we have to know that and continue to ground ourselves in the fact that God is going to be faithful to his promises in spite of time. And he is part of what makes him God is that in spite of time, his promises will be fulfilled and he'll be there to see them through. Now, what we see here is Joseph doesn't really get the end of his journey. He's not finally buried in the cave at the end of Genesis like Jacob is. In a sense, his body is suspended in time in the Egyptian way, to the point you've already hit, Ellis. But so we see this aching for the fulfillment of the promise. We see in verse 25 where you'd already called this out, Ellis, where Joseph says, take my bones with you, and God calls for you to return to the promised land. We'll see that promise fulfilled in the sense of Joseph, but ultimately this is an analogy for Exodus and for the rest of the Pentateuch for the Israelite people to have the promises of God fulfilled through them. And we're leaning into that with this, but not losing that thread of faith and knowing that God's plan will be fulfilled is hard for us to see in the forward view sometimes, and it's easier to see from the back view, to your point, Amber, as well.
Yeah.
But we're not automatons. We have free will. We're not on the puppet strings of God as a puppet master. So evil's going to happen because we don't follow his will. We're not listening to his voice. We're not doing what we know we should, or we just get away from him, completely and go our own separate ways, as we saw in Genesis 3 in the fall. But God is going to be faithful and find ways to bring his plan back on track and be sure it gets done in spite of us, because of us, through us.
I always go back to James, where he basically says that God can in no way be associated with evil. God doesn't touch evil. God is as far away from evil as you can possibly get, and he doesn't use evil to tempt us. So he has nothing to do with evil. I think, to Amber's point, to your point too, Craig, absolutely that. But he is sovereign, so he's in control,
Right.
and he can turn it into good. And I think that's absolutely what Joseph meant. Is that no matter what our intentions, God is going to bring good for those who trust him, and Joseph was able to trust him. You have a character analysis here too. It keeps happening with Joseph compared to his brothers. I've always felt like people who are paranoid about other people's motives, or say that they're assuming people are going to act a certain way, uh, maybe towards them, maybe in a bad way, because that's the way they act. So the brothers, they tried to kill Joseph. That's their bent, and so they're just assuming Joseph's going to act in kind. And when he doesn't, it's shocking and surprising to them, and they're not sure whether or not to believe it. Right? Because we're going to assume people are going to treat us the way we tend to treat people. And if we tend to treat people poorly, then we're going to assume they're trying to do the same thing to us. If we are backstabbers, people who are backstabbers are always paranoid about people stabbing them in the back. Why? Because they're assuming people act the way they do, which is to stab people in the back. And so you have a little bit, I think, here another showcase of a compare contrast between the character of Joseph, the character of his brothers, who are still struggling with this. But it also shows that you've got a nation that's building here, and it's not perfect.
Yeah.
It is not perfect. It's not a good thing to try and clean up the history of your nation to the point where it's not truth, right? It's not the way it really was. We tend to do that with our own history. We want to clean it up, and we don't want to talk about the bad parts. But the bad parts are part of what make our nation what it is. And eventually, what make it great is that we can talk about the bad parts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is what the Bible does so brilliantly. I love the story here where you still have this thing going on between the brothers. And guess what? It's not going to end here. These guys the tribes are going to be fighting. You go to the book of Judges. Oh my gosh. They're constantly at each other. And the book of Judges is really the story of how these 12 tribes, really autonomous, don't really want to work with each other. And they come together whenever there's an external threat. When they get a common enemy, common external threat, that's when they come together under one judge to fight that common external threat. Once that common external threat is gone, they go back into their separate tribes, and they're constantly bickering and fighting with each other. So this doesn't end. This is
America.
Yeah, exactly. 13 colonies, and don't mess with Texas. We're very tribal, right? And I come from the tribe of Texas, right? So it is. It's a human nature thing, isn't it? It's a human nature thing.
I had one more thought when I was thinking about this verse with the brothers. I was trying to think about what exactly is Joseph saying about God here. And it made me think of a piece of tapestry. If you've ever seen an old piece of tapestry and you've turned it over, the back of it is where all the threads are knotted and tied, and it's like a hopeless mess. Like you can't make sense of it. You by the back, you cannot tell what the front is going to look like. You can't make sense of it. But when you turn it over, the front is where the beautiful piece of art is. And that's one of my favorite ways of kind of viewing God here and God's work in our lives, especially during hard times when I'm struggling. I really can think of it then, is that I get a picture of God weaving a beautiful tapestry together of my life, both with light and dark colors, the joy and the sorrow times. And on this side of heaven, I may never get to see, I only see the backside. I only see the knots and the threads, and I can't quite figure out what it's going to make of it, what the frayed edges, the hard times, the colors. But I one day trust that when I get to go to the other side, I get to see God's point of view and how he was making this beautiful picture all along with a plan and a purpose. And that's one of the ways that I kind of helped me see this passage this week.
No, that's awesome. And that's right on. There are certain people going through life, and Joseph seems to have been one of them. There are certain people who have this ability to see that other side of the tapestry, where most of us are looking at this ugly mess on the backside, and we're pulling our hair out, worrying because it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't look beautiful. It's kind of ugly. But there are people who can always see that other side. And in fact, I preached a sermon on that. It's a funeral sermon about the passage in Psalms that says, "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints." The idea to call death precious seems just wrong and just awful. But that's because we're looking at death from this side of eternity. God is looking at it from the other side, and from the other side, it's beautiful. From this side, it just seems like it's stealing, it's taking away. It's we don't like dealing with it. But from the other side, from God's side, it's amazing. And Paul could see that. Paul says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." It's a winning proposition. So, I think that's exactly what Joseph sees. He sees, it was a mess. It was hard. It was a struggle. I wouldn't want to do it again. But God took something that was bad, and he made something good out of it. Saved an entire nation. He saved the nation, right? And plus other parts of the world that he saved as well. That's excellent. Excellent point. Thanks, Amber, for pointing that out.
And real quick, just to add on or tack on to that,
Hmm.
I think you're absolutely right, Ellis. In our own everyday view, we feel that sense of dread about death. We don't want to face it. We keep trying to put it off, much like the Egyptians did in our own way. We're not mummifying, but use of medicine, use of anything we can do, of programs, of
Plastic surgery to try to keep us young.
surgery, lifelong health that we're trying to get to, right?
Yeah.
But in a sense, we have an instinct. We know that death is part of who we are and part of what makes life so beautiful. And J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, he explores this theme with the elves. The elves are a long-lasting race of Middle Earth. They can live hundreds, thousands of years. They actually are jealous of men, the race of men, because they die and they get to go to the next realm and be closer to Iluvatar, their god. That's the sense of their one God.
Yeah.
And they go and have this sense of communion that the men do, that the elves will never have, and they're jealous of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. You get brownie points for bringing in Tolkien into the discussion. And
Every week, we'll get something.
Yeah,
Yes.
and this Wednesday is May 4th, so you got to kind of do a Star Wars analogy.
There you go.
Yeah,
I'll try to work again.
well, those movies do deal with the themes of death, the themes of mortality and immortality, and what matters in life. They really are. Tolkien was one of the best at it, but all those actually do that. Good versus evil, good triumphing over evil. Those are huge, major themes that we resonate with. We love those movies because we resonate with those themes as well. And these are themes that the Bible deals with all the time that Joseph was dealing with. Very good. Okay, so and it moves into Exodus. Genesis 50 goes into Exodus. In Exodus 1, we're not going to cover it. It's part of the readings this week, but it's a seamless story. And so it just picks right up with where Joseph left off. And then eventually you have they're entrapped into slavery because they're so fruitful, because they're so successful as a nation. The nation is growing, and Pharaoh in Exodus 1 is like a new Pharaoh who comes along who didn't know Joseph, is like, these people are too smart and too fruitful and too numerous, and they're going to overtake us. So they actually enslave them because they're fearful of them, because they're so successful. So that's an important thing to see that's happening in the next movement of the story. We'll be covering Exodus next week as we look at that. So we want to look at Matthew chapter 17 now, and it's Transfiguration is kind of the centerpiece of the chapter. There's some other things happening in the chapter as well. But Amber, why don't you start us off kind of setting up what's something that kind of really that you keyed into with this Matthew chapter 17?
Absolutely. I actually wanted to skip the Transfiguration and actually skip to the temple tax real fast. I thought this was really interesting. I think it's a part
that's the last scene in Matthew 17. Yeah,
that's
go ahead.
exact. It's the last little paragraph here at the end of this chapter. So I kind of skipped to the end to talk about, but I think it's a section that we kind of read past or maybe not understand. And it kind of struck me. So I wanted to talk about a couple things here. This is where Peter just got asked, does your rabbi even pay the taxes for the temple? And Peter's like, yeah. I don't know if he was being honest or if he just doesn't like conflict, because it was a very charged question. Yes. Honestly, if you think about what's actually happening and what Jesus is up to, and he already kind of has beef with the leaders of Jerusalem.
They're trying to trap him. They're trying to trap him.
They are. Yeah. So Peter's like, yeah, of course. And then Jesus now talks to Peter, and he's like, Peter, what's going on here? Do you think kings, the children of the king, pay taxes? Logically, if you follow Jesus, they didn't, right? Today, our president, right, in our American mindset, yeah, if the president's children worked, they would pay taxes. But back then, if you were a king, if you were a king, democracy, if you were a king, then your children wouldn't pay taxes, right? You guys would share resources. And so he's just being really practical here. He's like, does the children or does others? And Peter's like, no, others. And he's like, exactly. That's exactly what we're doing here at the temple. Who's the king of the temple? God.
Yeah, God.
Yeah. So who does Jesus say he is? Jesus, and Peter's like, well, you're the son of God. You're the child of the king. And he's like, exactly. So the children are free, is what he's saying. The children are exempt, some translations say. And so what is Jesus trying to do here? Well, I wanted to make sure, is Jesus the son of God? Well, what's the scriptures tell us twice. God himself tells us. First time is in Matthew 3. We've read it several months ago. Matthew 3, where the baptism, and after the baptism of Jesus, dove comes down, a voice from the sky, and it says, God speaks, this is my son who I am well pleased. And that's the first time. And then here in chapter 17, you see it again during this transfiguration. The sky, he interrupts Peter, and the sky opens up and speaks, and it's the God saying, this is my son who I am well pleased. Listen to him. He added something there. Listen to him. I'm pretty sure he's talking to Peter there. And so
Yeah.
probably not, but that's just my joke. But yeah, so here you have it. Twice God himself has called Jesus his son. So that's pretty much what Jesus is saying here. But yeah, that leads us into the transfiguration. So Craig and Ellis, what do you guys have there?
Yeah. Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah. So, and I'll get into the transfiguration, but I want to set it up a little bit by going into the end of chapter 16 of Matthew. At the end of our previous chapter, Jesus is telling the disciples that they have to pick up their cross and follow him and able to go where he's going. And the Father will return and, quote, repay each person according to what he has done. Then Jesus says something in verse 28 that I just couldn't blow past and has honestly confused me for a long time. He says, truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. I mean, to me, this has always been an allusion to the second coming. So I couldn't ignore it because on the face of it, it meant Jesus was coming back before some of the disciples passed away. We obviously know that didn't happen. The second coming is a bedrock pillar of the Christian belief. We believe it's still going to happen. All the ancient creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed says that he'll come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. So what's Jesus saying here? For a long time, I thought it was an allusion to a fancy word here, partial preterism, which is a position that R.C. Sproul lays out very well in his book, The Last Days According to Jesus, if you're interested. But essentially, that position says that part of these apocalyptic prophecies by Jesus were fulfilled by the destruction of the temple by Rome in 70 A.D. The Jews revolted against Roman authority in the late 60s, and basically the Romans just came in and sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and spread the Jews out throughout the empire in what's known as the diaspora. And essentially that killed Israel as a nation until 1948, when all the Jews came back after the Second World War and the United Nations formed Israel again. But moving forward into Matthew 17, I was finally able to start putting the pieces together. Thank you, Well Bible Reading Program, to really understand that this is setting up the transfiguration itself. These verses at the end of 16 are an allusion to what is about to happen. And Amber, I think you said earlier in our pre-conversation that these chapter breaks are very unfortunate sometimes. And this is one of those where if you're just reading a 16 and you don't continue immediately into 17, you're going to lose that thread. And it does us a disservice.
Yeah, no, that's good. No, that's right. And some of those standing there that Jesus is referring to would have been Peter, James, and John. In the very next chapter, see his glory right on earth. They see it immediately. So yeah, I think most conservative scholars point to that as being the fulfillment of what Jesus says at the end of chapter 16. So good catch, Craig. That is super important. The transfiguration in that sense doesn't start in chapter 17, verse 1. It starts in chapter 16, the last verse of 16, right?
Exactly.
And so yeah, that's absolutely what's happening here. This is the kind of an epiphany, a revelation of who Jesus is. It's really it's in the sense the veil being pulled back for a moment, so that these disciples, his closest circle, Peter, James, and John, his closest circle could see who he really was in all of his glory. And it's interesting how it happens and what happens there. I mean, so the transfiguration happens. So Jesus is talking to, first he's talking to, was it Moses and Elijah, right? Peter, James, and John are there. He's talking to Moses. Moses and Elijah appear. So there's three of them standing there talking. And then Peter, of course, being Peter, right, puts his foot in his mouth, but he wants to build the shelters because the Festival of Booths was happening. And the Festival of Booths is when they would celebrate, they would commemorate the wilderness wandering years, and they would literally put a little shack in the backyard, so to speak, and live there during this time to associate themselves with how their forefathers lived in the wilderness, right? And so this is, I think, what Peter is referring to. He wants to build these little shacks for all three of them since they were in that season. And it's kind of like I picture Jesus kind of going, "Oh my gosh, what Peter." So, but he wants to do that, and then suddenly that's when the cloud comes, the voice from heaven, as Amber's already mentioned, a close connection to the baptism, same voice, same basic words. This is my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. Um, and I think the listen to him is important, as Amber said. The listen to him is super important because here you have Elijah, Moses, and Jesus standing there together. And when Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" The answer was, well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're one of the other prophets. There were some saying he was Moses. There were some. The Samaritans believed that the Messiah was coming in the tradition of Moses. He was going to be a lawgiver and a law explainer. And so there's all these ideas. And so here you have a scene where it's saying, no, there's Moses, there's Elijah, and there's Jesus. They're three different people, and they're all three are there. And then the cloud comes, and God says, the cloud comes, and Moses and Elijah disappear, and God's saying, this is my son. In other words, it's not Moses, it's not Elijah. Salvation, the answer is not found in the law. It's not found in the prophets. Ultimately, it's found in Jesus. This one is my son. Don't confuse him with the other ones. It's this revelation, that this point of clarity that they really needed. And even when they're coming down from the mountain, if you'll notice, I mean, what are they talking about? They're asking, hey, the tradition is, supposedly the rumor is, Elijah's supposed to come back, blah, blah, blah. When is that happening? And Jesus explained, well, you're right. It already has happened. And then that's when they knew he was talking about John the Baptist. So there's all this confusion that the Transfiguration is really trying to clear up. And the point of it is, here's my son in all of his glory. Listen to him, right? It's okay. Moses is great. Elijah's great. But at the end, listen to him. This is the one you're supposed to be listening to. So I hope we catch that, right? That's a big thing to catch. It's actually the entire our Well Bible reading journey is all about that, isn't it? It's
Sure.
about listening to Jesus. We just want you to read the scriptures and ask Jesus to say something to you, right?
It's
Yeah.
good. When I was reading through this, I was struck by like, wow, this is like miraculous moment. Like I was just trying to envision the face shining, the white clothes. I was trying to envision it like, wow, this is like miraculous, almost like miracle like in my mind when I was picturing it and reading it. So I started picturing what this would be like. And it dawned on me, this word trying to transform or transfiguration or to change form, it basically just suggests that something is changing from the innermost nature that is now being outwardly visible. That's sort of what this word means in the Greek. And so this essentially was not a new miracle. I kind of dawned on me this week. This is not a new miracle, but rather it was kind of a disclosure or like God revealing the thing that is, it's like the real miracle is that Jesus has been like covering his real glory this whole time. Like that's the true miracle, is this ongoing all the time ability to cover his full glory, that who he is. He can live in the flesh and hide that glory, but then he can reveal it when he wants. So it's not a new miracle, even that's how I envisioned it at first. All of a sudden it hit me. Wow, this is like a revealing of an ongoing miracle that's happening all the time. I don't know. I saw that very differently this time. Is that reasonable to think about, Ellis?
Oh no, I think so. No, I think that's great. That's a great insight. There are these moments throughout the New Testament scriptures where it's as if the veil is pulled aside a little bit and you get a glimpse of it. It happens at the baptism, to your point earlier, and there is this connection between baptism. There's a connection between baptism, transfiguration, and Gethsemane for me. Gethsemane is another moment when some call it the transfiguration of agony, where Jesus' sweat is pouring down off his face like great big drops of blood. His face is contorted. He's pleading with God. So there are these moments when the veil is kind of pulled aside and you're seeing Jesus or you're seeing God in all his glory. Baptism. There's a couple of times with the miracles when Jesus is walking on water, the disciples think he's a ghost. So there's this sense of where he's walking and there's this glow illumination about him. These are these moments when people when people in the story catch a glimpse of Jesus. Throw back to Moses when he's up in the mountain, he comes down, he has to put a veil over his face because the glory of God is shining. The Shekinah glory is
Mhm.
shining, and people are afraid to look at him. So he puts the veil over his face. And so, yeah, it's all of that. It's very much in there. We every once in a while catch this amazing glimpse of Jesus. I want to kind of finish up with that. We're out of time. But just to let you know, guys out there, we love that you're reading the scripture, and we're asking you to ask Jesus to speak to you. That's the whole aim behind the whole thing. We love talking about the scripture, but at the end of the day, we want Jesus. We want you to hear from Jesus. It's great to hear from us. I hope it helps fill in some of the blanks, spaces, but mainly we want you every day to go to Jesus and ask him to speak to you. And we are confident that he's going to do that. God bless you until we see you again. We'll see you later.